Hi again. This time I'm going to be working from section 1.8. I'm going to be working on problems 10 and 13. And my reason for picking these problems is to show you that there is more than one possible correct answer. There's actually infinite correct answers. So we have to make sure that what we're looking at is the same in all of those answers. So first of all, we're asked to draw a possible graph of f of x, assuming f of x is defined and continuous for all real x values. And then they go on to tell us, for problem number 10, that the limit of the function f of x as x approaches infinity is equal to negative infinity. This means that as x values get larger and larger and larger, f of x values are getting closer and closer to negative infinity. They're approaching negative infinity. And we're also told that the limit of the function f of x as x approaches negative infinity is equal to negative infinity. In other words, as x gets larger and larger and larger in that negative direction, the function itself will get larger and larger and larger in the negative direction. In other words, it will start to approach negative infinity on the left side as well. So whenever we're looking at as x approaches infinity or negative infinity, we call that end behavior. It tells us what's happening to our graph for large values of x in the large positive values of x and large negative values of x. What it doesn't tell us is anything about small values of x. So one thing I know is that as x gets larger and larger and larger in the positive direction, my output is getting larger and larger and larger in the negative direction. In other words, f of x is approaching negative infinity. And the same thing is true over here on the left side of my graph. As x gets larger and larger and larger in this negative direction, the function itself is starting to approach negative infinity. Now, in the middle, since they didn't tell us anything about that, we could just go ahead and connect these lines. That's one way to draw this graph. Here's another way to draw this graph. I still need to have f of x approaching negative infinity as x gets larger and larger in the positive direction and as x gets larger and larger in the negative direction. But since they didn't tell me anything else at all about this particular function, for smaller values of x, I don't know exactly what's going on, which means that my graph might actually look like that. Both of these answers would be correct answers because they both meet the conditions that were given. For the end behavior, f of x is approaching negative infinity as x approaches positive infinity and as x approaches negative infinity. So let's go ahead and look at section 1.8, number 13. In this particular problem, we see again that it's asking us for the limit of f of x as x approaching positive infinity is equal to negative infinity, just like last time. But then this time, the limit of the function as x approaches negative infinity is actually a value. It's the value 3. So as x gets larger and larger in the negative direction, the function itself is going to be approaching 3. It's the limit of that function is 3, which means that it's approaching 3. So one way I could draw this function, let me put in some spacing here. When the output at y equals 3, I'm putting that in there because as a reference to help me to be able to draw my graph. Because, well, I'll just look at that left side first. It says that as x is approaching negative infinity, the function itself is approaching this line here, y equals 3. The function is approaching the value 3. Then over here on this side, it's like we had before. The function is approaching negative infinity as the x values get larger and larger. Again, in the middle, doesn't tell me anything. So let me try to clean this up to make it smooth and continuous. Too big of an eraser I have there. You know what? I'm just going to start over with this graph so that you can get a nice clean view of it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I have this, what's known as a horizontal asymptote here. And I can say that maybe my graph looks like that. That meets the conditions that as x gets larger and larger, the function is approaching negative infinity, and as x gets larger and larger in the negative direction, the function is approaching 3. In other words, the limit of the function as x approaches negative infinity is 3. All right, let me show you another way this graph could have looked. Because remember, all the condition we're told is that as x gets larger and larger in the negative direction, the output has to approach 3. And as x gets larger and larger in the positive direction, the output has to approach negative infinity. So that could have looked like that. There's no reason the function could not have looked like that instead of the way I drew it the first time. Of course, I have to be a little neater here because what I drew there a second ago actually wasn't even a function. It's just that I'm at the bottom of my iPad and it's hard to get nice, neat lines. So there. Again, the conditions that we were asked to graph are the same. In both cases, as the x value gets larger, the function itself gets smaller and is approaching negative infinity. And as the x value gets larger and larger in the negative direction, the function itself is approaching the value 3. And that was Siri jumping in there on the recording. All right, I hope this helps. Bye.